For centuries, the world believed Ottoman princesses lived a dream life, draped in silk, crowned with jewels, and worshipped inside golden palaces. But the truth was far from a fairy tale. Behind the walls of Topkapi Palace, many of these young girls did not look forward to their wedding night. They dreaded it. Some begged God not for love, but for death. And in the spring of 1623, the palace walls shook with the piercing scream of a 15-year-old princess. Her name was Fatma Sultan. That scream was the sound of a ritual so dark, history tried to bury it for 600 years. To the outside world, Fatma Sultan was the daughter of power. Born to Sultan Ahmed Ferrer and raised in the glittering halls of Istanbul, she was a prodigy, intelligent, beautiful, a child of privilege. But within the palace, her fate had already been decided. Ottoman princesses were not free to choose their lives. They were bargaining chips, traded to secure treaties, silence enemies, and buy loyalty. And long before their weddings, they endured a preparation unlike any other. Not lessons in love, not guidance in family life, but a system designed to strip away pride, silence the will, and mold them into obedience. What began as silk and ceremony ended in tears and terror. And for Fatma Sultan, this journey led her from starlit gardens to a chamber where her voice would be broken forever. So what exactly happened on that wedding night? And why were Ottoman princesses so afraid of the very destiny others envied? That the Ottoman Empire was at its height. Its armies thundered across 3 continents, its sultans commanded more wealth than kings of Europe, and its capital, Istanbul, dazzled like a jewel of the East. From the outside, Topkapi Palace seemed like paradise. Golden domes touched the sky. Marble courtyards overflowed with fountains. Perfumed gardens stretched endlessly, filled with roses and nightingales. To foreign visitors, it looked like heaven on earth. They imagined the princesses of the empire living like goddesses, draped in silk, dripping with jewels, served by hundreds of attendants. But this was only the illusion, the image the empire wanted the world to see. Behind those same gilded walls, reality was far darker, because the daughters of the Sultan, the very princesses outsiders envied, lived not in freedom, but in fear. They were not fairy tale brides. They were pawns in a cruel game of politics, and their most terrifying fate awaited them not on the battlefield, but on their wedding night. Every tragedy begins with light, and for Fatma Sultan, that light was her childhood. Born into the grandeur of the Ottoman Empire in the 17th century, Fatma Sultan was the daughter of power itself. Her very birth was celebrated across Istanbul with cannons, prayers, and gifts sent from every province of the empire. To the outside world, she was the luckiest girl alive, a princess born into unimaginable wealth and status. But inside the walls of the harem, her life followed a different rhythm. Unlike ordinary children, Fatma's days were not her own. From the very beginning, she was raised not just as a child, but as an asset of the empire. Fatma was not left to play freely in gardens or chase butterflies like village girls her age. Instead, her mornings began with tutors, scrolls, and the wisdom of empires past. She studied astronomy, learning how the stars and planets moved across the heavens. The Ottomans believed the skies could reveal fate, and young Fatma was captivated, perhaps because deep inside she longed to understand her own destiny. She also loved poetry. Words flowed from her lips like water from a fountain. She memorized Persian verses, crafted her own lines in Ottoman Turkish, and even recited classical Arabic poetry with the elegance of a seasoned scholar. Her tutors often whispered that Fatma had the sharpness of a philosopher's mind trapped in the body of a young girl. Languages, too, became her gift. While many Ottoman men struggled with more than one tongue, Fatma mastered several: Turkish, Arabic, Persian. Even a touch of Greek from whispers carried through the walls of the palace. She could switch between them with grace, a skill that impressed foreign envoys, who sometimes caught glimpses of her brilliance during court ceremonies. There is a story told in Palace Whispers. One night, while studying the night sky with her tutor, Fatma asked a question that silenced the room. She pointed to the stars and said, "If every star has its place, does mine ever move, or is it fixed forever?" It was a question too deep for her age, and perhaps too dangerous for her tutors to answer, because in truth her star was fixed. Her destiny had been sealed before she was even born. But in that moment, her brilliance shone. She was not just another princess locked in a palace, she was a girl who thought beyond the marble walls, who dreamed of more than silk dresses and golden cages. To an outsider, Fatma's life still looked perfect. She lived in rooms decorated with silk carpets from Persia, crystal lamps from Venice, and fountains carved from marble. She ate the sweetest fruits, wore gowns embroidered with gold, and heard musicians play lullabies from every corner of the empire. But this luxury came with invisible chains. She was always watched, always guarded. Every step she took, every word she spoke was noted by attendants loyal not to her, but to the Sultan. She could not walk in the city streets, could not choose her friends, could not dream of love like other young girls. Even her tutors, the people she trusted, reminded her daily, "You are not yours. You belong to the dynasty." And she knew it was true. The cruelest truth of all was this: Fatma had no choice in how her life would unfold. In the Ottoman dynasty, princesses were tools of politics. They were married not for love, but for power. Their wedding nights were not beginnings of happiness, but transactions that bound families, secured loyalty, and often ruined lives. Fatma's brilliance, her poetry, her love of the stars, none of it mattered. The empire did not see her as a mind or even as a heart. They saw her as a daughter to be exchanged, a gift to be given, a pawn to be moved across the chessboard of politics. And she knew it. That knowledge shadowed even her happiest moments. Every time she wrote a verse about love, she wondered if she would ever feel it. Every time she looked at the stars, she wondered if fate would ever give her freedom. Every time she dreamed, she woke with the bitter truth: she was born into chains. What makes Fatma Sultan's story so haunting is not just her later suffering, but the fact that she understood her prison even as a child. She was not blind to her situation. Her intelligence made it worse. Imagine being a girl of 12, already aware that the empire had written your life for you. Imagine knowing that one day, men you had never chosen would decide where you lived, who you married, and how you spent your nights. Fatma could recite poetry about freedom, but she could never taste it. She could map the stars, but never steer her own path. She could speak many languages, but never speak for herself. And so Fatma grew into her teenage years inside a cage so beautiful that outsiders envied it. But beauty can hide sorrow, and wealth can hide pain. She was intelligent, graceful, and admired. But she was also a prisoner of her bloodline. Her brilliance made her unforgettable, but it could not save her from what was coming. Because while her childhood was filled with learning and light, her adulthood would be filled with shadows, and the first of those shadows would fall on the night she feared the most: her wedding night. Palaces shine on the outside, but deep inside, in hidden rooms, even princesses were broken before they were married. After her childhood of brilliance, Fatma Sultan entered a new stage of life. She was no longer treated as the little girl who could recite poetry or map the stars. She was now a young woman, and for the Ottoman dynasty, that meant one thing: preparation for marriage. But this preparation was not the soft guidance of a mother, or the joyful excitement of a girl waiting for love. No. In the Ottoman palaces, princesses were trained, drilled, and bent into obedience through a system that looked more like breaking a horse than preparing a bride. It began with the bow. Every morning, Fatma and the other girls were made to practice postures of submission. The overseer, an older woman who had once endured the same rituals herself, barked commands as the girls bent their backs and lowered their heads. The angle mattered. The exact distance their foreheads should hover above the ground was measured. Too high, and it was seen as arrogance. Too low, and it was shameful. Day after day, hour after hour, Fatma practiced bowing until her spine ached. This was not a lesson in manners. It was a lesson in power. By breaking the body, the palace was also breaking the will. The rituals went beyond the body. They reached into her very tongue. Fatma, who once spoke 4 languages, who loved poetry and philosophy, was suddenly forbidden from speaking freely. A rule was given: she could use only 43 words in the presence of her future husband. 43 words. Nothing more. Each word had to be delivered with the right tone, the right pause, the right softness. If she stepped outside these rules, she would be punished. Imagine the cruelty. A girl who once debated scholars in the palace halls was now reduced to silence. Her intelligence was erased, her voice caged. The princess who once looked at the stars and asked bold questions was told she must now become a shadow. Silent, obedient, invisible. Even her steps were not her own. In the training halls of the harem, Fatma was taught how to walk as though her body itself was property. Her chin must tilt at a precise angle. Her arms must hang in exact symmetry. Her feet could not move too fast or too slow, but at a rhythm that projected obedience. Each mistake brought harsh correction. The overseers carried sticks, and when the angle of a wrist or the pace of a step slipped from perfection, a sharp crack of wood on marble echoed through the halls. Fatma's every movement was choreographed, not for beauty but for control. This training was not short. It lasted weeks, sometimes months, By the end, even the brightest princesses seemed hollowed out, their laughter gone, their spark dimmed. Fatma, the girl who once filled the palace with verses of love and wonder, now moved through the halls like a shadow. She bowed on command, spoke in fragments, and walked like a doll built for display. The transformation was complete. A child of brilliance had been turned into a bride of obedience. And this was only the beginning. What makes this ritual so haunting is not just its cruelty, but its secrecy. To outsiders, Ottoman princesses seemed privileged, surrounded by jewels and silks. But behind the silk curtains, away from foreign eyes, their spirits were broken in silence, and Fatma knew all of this was only preparing her for something darker, because whispered among the girls, passed in frightened voices late at night, was the warning of what came next. A ritual spoken of only in fragments, a ritual so cruel it was carried out not in the golden halls above, but in the shadows beneath the palace, an underground chamber, a secret tradition, the final step of preparation, mini cliffhanger. Fatma thought the bowing, the silence, and the walking had broken her, but she had no idea the darkest ritual was still waiting, hidden underground, away from all eyes. What the world never saw was buried in silence. Deep below the marble floors where sultans prayed, a different ritual unfolded, one meant not for God, but for control. The palace above glowed with gold and music. Lanterns flickered across polished floors. Courtiers laughed, feasted, and whispered of power. But beneath all that brilliance, hidden in the belly of the palace, was a world carved of stone and shadow, a place the public never knew existed. This was where the Ottoman princesses were sent before their wedding night. And it was here, in the suffocating silence of underground chambers, that Fatma Sultan was dragged into her final stage of preparation. The room she entered looked more like a nightmare than a classroom. Lined along the walls stood rows of wooden mannequins dressed in fragments of silk, shaped to resemble men. Their carved faces were blank, their arms stiff, but to the frightened eyes of young women, these figures seemed alive, like mute witnesses waiting to judge every mistake. Each mannequin was positioned at different angles, forcing Fatma to rehearse postures of obedience. She was made to kneel before one, bow to another, and stand motionless in front of a third while her overseers shouted commands. It was a rehearsal, not of marriage, but of submission. Every tilt of her chin, every flutter of her eyelashes was corrected. The overseers wanted perfection, and when perfection did not come, punishment followed. The most chilling part of the chamber was not the mannequins. It was the mirrors. Polished bronze panels were mounted along the walls, reflecting every movement back at her. There was no corner where she could hide from her own reflection. As she stumbled through bowing drills, she was forced to watch herself tremble. As she misstepped in walking rituals, she saw the overseer's stick strike her shoulders in the reflection behind her. The mirrors were not for vanity. They were weapons. They made her witness her own breaking, as though to carve the image into her mind forever. "See what you are," the mirrors seemed to whisper. "See what you are becoming." There were darker tools as well. Before some of the sessions, the overseers brought in small bowls filled with heavy oils and powders. The air thickened with strange, sweet smoke. These oils were rubbed into her skin, pressed into her hair, even painted across her lips. Fatma didn't know their names, but she knew their effects. Some dulled her body until her muscles felt heavy, as though her spirit itself was sinking into the ground. Others made her dizzy, her thoughts slipping like sand through her fingers. It was not medicine, it was control. A body that could not resist was easier to shape. A mind clouded by smoke was easier to silence, and so the brilliance of the girl who once debated scholars was drowned under fumes and oils, until she no longer recognized the sharpness of her own thoughts, and when she resisted, punishment came swiftly. The overseers carried long rods, not sharpened, but heavy. A mistaken posture meant a strike across her back. A slip of the tongue meant the rod cracking against the floor inches from her face. Too much hesitation, and the smoke itself was increased, until she choked on it, gasping for air, tears burning down her cheeks. Fatma learned quickly that pain was not random. It was calculated. Punishment was not just to hurt her, but to teach her. Her body was no longer her own. Her voice was no longer her own. Even her thoughts belonged to the dynasty. Days turned into weeks. The underground chamber became her prison. The mannequins her silent tormentors. The mirrors her executioners. At first, she tried to fight. She clung to her memories of poetry, of starlight, of laughter echoing in her childhood halls. But slowly, piece by piece, the fight drained out of her. One evening, after hours of bowing and kneeling, she collapsed to the floor. The overseers did not lift her. They left her lying there, her cheek pressed against the cold stone. staring into the reflection of herself on the bronze panels. What she saw was not Fatma Sultan, the brilliant girl, the dreamer, the poet. What she saw was a hollow figure in silk, her eyes dim, her back bent, and in that moment, something inside her began to give way. From that day forward, her steps grew slower, her voice smaller. The overseers no longer needed to strike her as often because she corrected herself before they raised their rods. The smoke no longer made her choke because she accepted it as part of her breath. The girl who once argued with scholars now rehearsed obedience in silence. The child who once memorized the stars now memorized the angles of her own bow. Fatma Sultan was breaking. But as cruel as this was, the whispers among the girls were worse. Because all of this, the mannequins, the mirrors, the oils, the punishments, was not the end. It was only rehearsal. What awaited on the true wedding night was said to be far more terrifying. A ritual so secret that even in the palace, it was spoken only in fragments, in whispers, in hurried warnings before silence returned. And as Fatma lay awake at night in her chamber, the smell of smoke still clinging to her hair, one thought haunted her. The sun rose over Istanbul like a trumpet blast. From the Bosphorus to the hills, the city shimmered with celebration. Streets overflowed with banners of red and gold. Musicians filled the air with the thunder of drums and the piercing cries of flutes. Bakers handed out sweet pastries dusted with sugar. Wine flowed like rivers, and children chased each other through the crowds. It was not an ordinary day. It was a wedding day. A royal wedding day. For the people of the empire, it was a moment of pride, a spectacle to dazzle the world. Foreign ambassadors lined balconies to report back to their kings and queens. Merchants whispered that the festivities alone would prove the Ottoman Empire's unmatched wealth. To outsiders, it was a fairy tale unfolding under the morning sun. But for Fatma Sultan, the bride at the heart of it all, the day felt less like a beginning and more like a funeral. Behind the tall palace gates, while the city sang, Fatma trembled in silence. Her attendants dressed her in layer upon layer of embroidered silk, each robe heavier than the last. A golden belt tightened around her waist until her breathing came in shallow gasps. A crown, jeweled with emeralds and pearls, was lowered onto her head, so heavy it pressed into her temples like iron. Every piece of her attire was designed to impress, to show her as a jewel of the dynasty. But for Fatma it was not clothing. It was a cage. The silks weighed her down. The crown bent her neck. The jeweled veil over her face blurred her vision, as though she was being erased, transformed into a symbol rather than a living woman. Doctors later whispered of her trembling hands, of how she could not steady her breath. Some called them panic attacks, but no one dared say it aloud, for in the Ottoman court, even fear had to be hidden behind gold and silk. At last, the palace gates opened, and the procession began. Fatma was carried in a litter draped in gold, veils hiding her face. Around her, musicians played and soldiers marched. Cannons fired from the harbor. To the crowds lining the streets, it was a vision of glory. The princess of the empire, radiant and untouchable, embarking on her new life. But inside the veil, Fatma's tears blurred the world. The cheers of the crowd were deafening, but to her they sounded like a chant. A chant that sealed her fate. Every step forward felt like a step deeper into a prison she could never escape. To the people of Istanbul, it was a triumph. They saw the silks, the jewels, the smiling courtiers. They saw a bride stepping into her destiny with grace. They saw the power of the Ottoman throne, glittering under the sunlight. Mothers lifted their daughters onto their shoulders, whispering, "One day you could be like her." But they did not see the truth. They did not see the way Fatma's breath hitched beneath her veil, the way her lips moved in silent prayers. They did not see that her fingers, hidden in her sleeves, dug so hard into her palms that her nails left marks of blood. To them, it was a fairy tale. To her, it was a funeral for her soul. As the procession reached the palace of her new husband, Fatma's dread only deepened. The gates loomed ahead like jaws waiting to close. The crowd roared in celebration. Musicians played louder, as though to drown out the silence of the bride herself. When she was finally lowered from the litter, she stumbled under the weight of her attire. Two attendants rushed to steady her. To the crowd, it looked like modesty, the bashful bride bowing her head. But the truth was darker. Her body was collapsing under the sheer weight of her glory. Step by step, she was led into the chambers where her new life and her greatest terror awaited. Some records say that Fatma, before crossing the threshold of her husband's palace, whispered a final prayer. Not for wealth, not for power, not even for love. She prayed for strength, because while the empire saw a princess at the peak of splendor, Fatma knew the truth. She was stepping into a golden prison, where even her most private night would not belong to her. The city saw joy, the palace saw power, but Fatma felt only dread, because beyond those doors the real ritual was waiting, the one whispered about for centuries and hidden from the world's eyes. The day's celebrations had ended. The cannons grew silent, the music faded, and the guests departed with full bellies and dazzled eyes. For the people of Istanbul, the royal wedding had been a vision of paradise, golden banquets, dancing flames, jewels that sparkled like stars. But as cruel as this was, the whispers among the girls were worse. Because all of this, the mannequins, the mirrors, the oils, the punishments, was not the end. It was only rehearsal. What awaited on the true wedding night was said to be far more terrifying. A ritual so secret that even in the palace, it was spoken only in fragments, in whispers, in hurried warnings before silence returned. And as Fatma lay awake at night in her chamber, the smell of smoke still clinging to her hair, one thought haunted her. The sun rose over Istanbul like a trumpet blast. From the Bosphorus to the hills, the city shimmered with celebration. Streets overflowed with banners of red and gold. Musicians filled the air with the thunder of drums and the piercing cries of flutes. Bakers handed out sweet pastries dusted with sugar. Wine flowed like rivers, and children chased each other through the crowds. It was not an ordinary day. It was a wedding day. A royal wedding day. For the people of the empire, it was a moment of pride, a spectacle to dazzle the world. Foreign ambassadors lined balconies to report back to their kings and queens. Merchants whispered that the festivities alone would prove the Ottoman Empire's unmatched wealth. To outsiders, it was a fairy tale unfolding under the morning sun. But for Fatma Sultan, the bride at the heart of it all, the day felt less like a beginning and more like a funeral. Behind the tall palace gates, while the city sang, Fatma trembled in silence. Her attendants dressed her in layer upon layer of embroidered silk, each robe heavier than the last. A golden belt tightened around her waist until her breathing came in shallow gasps. A crown, jeweled with emeralds and pearls, was lowered onto her head, so heavy it pressed into her temples like iron. Every piece of her attire was designed to impress, to show her as a jewel of the dynasty. But for Fatma it was not clothing. It was a cage. The silks weighed her down. The crown bent her neck. The jeweled veil over her face blurred her vision, as though she was being erased, transformed into a symbol rather than a living woman. Doctors later whispered of her trembling hands, of how she could not steady her breath. Some called them panic attacks, but no one dared say it aloud, for in the Ottoman court, even fear had to be hidden behind gold and silk. At last, the palace gates opened, and the procession began. Fatma was carried in a litter draped in gold, veils hiding her face. Around her, musicians played and soldiers marched. Cannons fired from the harbor. To the crowds lining the streets, it was a vision of glory. The princess of the empire, radiant and untouchable, embarking on her new life. But inside the veil, Fatma's tears blurred the world. The cheers of the crowd were deafening, but to her they sounded like a chant. A chant that sealed her fate. Every step forward felt like a step deeper into a prison she could never escape. To the people of Istanbul, it was a triumph. They saw the silks, the jewels, the smiling courtiers. They saw a bride stepping into her destiny with grace. They saw the power of the Ottoman throne, glittering under the sunlight. Mothers lifted their daughters onto their shoulders, whispering, "One day you could be like her." But they did not see the truth. They did not see the way Fatma's breath hitched beneath her veil, the way her lips moved in silent prayers. They did not see that her fingers, hidden in her sleeves, dug so hard into her palms that her nails left marks of blood. To them, it was a fairy tale. To her, it was a funeral for her soul. As the procession reached the palace of her new husband, Fatma's dread only deepened. The gates loomed ahead like jaws waiting to close. The crowd roared in celebration. Musicians played louder, as though to drown out the silence of the bride herself. When she was finally lowered from the litter, she stumbled under the weight of her attire. Two attendants rushed to steady her. To the crowd, it looked like modesty, the bashful bride bowing her head. But the truth was darker. Her body was collapsing under the sheer weight of her glory. Step by step, she was led into the chambers where her new life and her greatest terror awaited. Some records say that Fatma, before crossing the threshold of her husband's palace, whispered a final prayer. Not for wealth, not for power, not even for love. She prayed for strength, because while the empire saw a princess at the peak of splendor, Fatma knew the truth. She was stepping into a golden prison, where even her most private night would not belong to her. The city saw joy, the palace saw power, but Fatma felt only dread, Because beyond those doors, the real ritual was waiting. The one whispered about for centuries and hidden from the world's eyes. The day's celebrations had ended. The cannons grew silent, the music faded, and the guests departed with full bellies and dazzled eyes. For the people of Istanbul, the royal wedding had been a vision of paradise: golden banquets, dancing flames, jewels that sparkled like stars. But for Fatma Sultan, the true ordeal was only beginning. She was led away from the laughter and song into the private gardens of the palace. There, hidden among trees and fountains, stood a pavilion like no other. Built centuries earlier by Mehmed the Conqueror himself, it was called the Nuptial Pavilion, an octagonal structure rising in 3 levels. Each level had a purpose. Each step had meaning. Every stone was designed not to honor the bride, but to strip her of her last fragments of freedom. Fatma was taken first into the marble chambers of purification. Here, attendants bathed her in tubs carved of white stone, filling the water with rose oil, sandalwood, and amber. To outsiders it seemed a ritual of beauty, a blessing for fertility. But the truth was far darker. The oils were mixed with secret compounds prepared by palace alchemists, diluted opium to dull her senses, mandrake to soften her will, and powders from distant lands meant to cloud her thoughts. As steam filled the chamber, Fatma's body grew heavy, her breath slowed, her eyes flickered between wakefulness and dream. The girl who once debated scholars in astronomy and poetry now sat in silence, her mind drifting like a leaf carried downstream. From the baths, she was taken to the second level, the Hall of Surrender. Here, her bridal attire was brought forth, a gown of white silk embroidered with threads of gold, pearls sewn into every fold. At first glance it looked like majesty, but in truth it was another prison. Hidden clasps and cords made it easy to restrain her. The weight of the fabric forced her posture into submission. The crown bent her head low, as though she were bowing forever. Anklets and bracelets tightened around her wrists and ankles, restricting her every movement. Even her shoes, with thick soles, slowed her steps, forcing her to walk as if the earth itself resisted her. She had been trained for months to bow, to step, to speak only in whispers of obedience. Now the dress itself became her final chain, transforming her into a living symbol of silence. But Fatma was not the only one being prepared. In another chamber, her husband, Damat Kara Mustafa Pasha, a man twice her age, seasoned by wars against Persia, was trained in his own way. Advisors and elders instructed him in methods of dominance, words designed to humiliate, gestures meant to impose fear, techniques of control passed down like weapons of conquest. For him, this was not a night of intimacy. It was a ceremony of power, a conquest of the empire's most sacred bloodline. At last, Fatma was led to the third and final level, the Chamber of Consummation. Its walls were draped in tapestries not of love, but of war. Battles won, cities burned, captive princesses kneeling before victorious sultans. Every symbol reminded her that her body was not her own, but another territory to be conquered. The bed itself was built for control. Cushions soaked with calming oils, cords hidden in the frames, lighting designed to weaken the spirit. When the doors closed, Fatma stood alone with her husband. At first, Kara Mustafa believed her silence was arrogance. He spoke the words of intimidation he had been taught, gestures of command, pressing his dominance upon her. But what he faced was not defiance, it was absence. Her body trembled uncontrollably, her lips moved in prayers too faint to hear, and her eyes stared into a place far beyond the chamber. The months of rituals, of bowing, of restricted words, of oils and punishments had already broken her. The brilliant girl who once gazed at the stars now looked at nothing at all. As the night wore on, her mind seemed to flee farther and farther from the room. What physicians of the time called sakma, the shock of the soul leaving the body, overtook her. She did not fight. She did not resist. She simply vanished into herself, a ghost inhabiting a body of flesh. And when the act of consummation was finally forced upon her, it was not the union of bride and groom. It was the extinguishing of a light. Observers later recorded what happened in coded notes. Fainting, bleeding, trembling, so violent attendants feared she would not survive the night. The wedding had been celebrated as a triumph for the empire, but for Fatma Sultan it was the death of the self. That night did not simply end her girlhood. It erased the brilliant mind who once dreamed of the stars, and left behind only a shadow, forever bound in silence. The palace bells rang to mark the dawn of a new day. The streets of Istanbul still echoed with the joy of the wedding celebrations. Merchants praised the empire's prosperity, poets wrote verses of the glorious union, and common folk spoke of the fairy tale marriage of the sultan's daughter. But behind the thick walls of the palace, The truth was very different. The Fatma Sultan who emerged from the chamber of consummation was no longer the radiant girl who had once debated astronomy with scholars, who wrote verses of poetry, who dreamed of the stars. That Fatma was gone. What returned was a hollow shell. In the days that followed, attendants noticed something terrifying. Fatma did not speak. She had once been eloquent, praised for her wit and intellect. But now her lips remained sealed. At first doctors assumed it was fatigue. Others whispered that she was possessed by jinns or cursed by evil eyes. But as days turned into weeks, her mutism continued. She could still hear, still nod faintly, but no words escaped her mouth. She answered questions with silence, obeyed commands without sound, and avoided eye contact even with her closest maids. To the physicians of the Ottoman court, it was a mystery. They diagnosed her with what they called bakire melancholisi, virginal melancholy. In today's language, it was trauma, the shock of a soul fractured under unbearable weight. The girl who once spoke the language of poetry now lived in a world without words. Her silence was not her only wound. At night, screams were often heard behind the heavy curtains of her chamber. Screams muffled, cut short, as though she tried to swallow them before anyone could hear. Fatma was haunted by panic attacks so violent that her body convulsed. She trembled when touched, recoiled at sudden sounds, and suffered from fainting spells during palace ceremonies. Servants reported that she would often wake drenched in sweat, clutching her chest, her eyes wild with terror. But the palace had no room for sympathy. Instead, her suffering was carefully hidden. The empire could not allow rumors of a broken princess. She was presented in public as serene, silent, obedient, a model of royal virtue. Behind closed doors, she lived in terror. Over time, Fatma began to refuse food. Plates of delicacies, honey-drenched baklava, roasted lamb, figs, saffron rice, were left untouched. Her body grew frail, her cheeks hollow. Doctors prescribed tonics of pomegranate milk and ground pearls. Nothing worked. She was fading, not just in spirit but in flesh. The vibrant girl who once laughed in palace gardens was vanishing day by day, consumed by an emptiness no medicine could heal. Despite her condition, the machinery of empire demanded she fulfill her role. Her husband, Kara Mustafa Pasha, continued the marriage. He sought heirs, not companionship. Children were born from this union, but they were not born of love. They were born of duty, necessity, empire. Witnesses wrote that she cradled her children with a distant gaze, as though holding them through a fog. She never sang lullabies, never told stories, never recited poems. The mother was present in body, absent in soul. Her palace quarters became tomb-like, curtains always drawn, mirrors removed, music forbidden. What once had been a chamber of light became a shrine to silence. By the 1640s, Fatma Sultan had become what courtiers called Hayale Kadın, the ghost woman. She appeared at official banquets dressed in jewels, her silence mistaken for dignity. Foreign ambassadors described her as mysterious, serene, even majestic. But those who served her knew the truth. She no longer wrote poetry. She no longer played instruments. She no longer looked at the stars. Her life had been reduced to rituals of survival. Breathing, walking, existing. One servant recorded in secret notes, "Her eyes are open, but she sees nothing. She lives among us, yet she is not here." As years passed, Fatma's health declined further. She suffered from weakness, chronic fevers, and fainting spells. Doctors continued to call it melancholy, offering prayers and herbal potions, but nothing eased her suffering. By 1652, she was too frail to leave her chambers. Her once brilliant mind, her once radiant presence, had withered into near silence and stillness. That year, at the age of only 49, Fatma Sultan died quietly in her bed. The empire announced her passing with grandeur. The noble daughter of Sultan Ahmed, a woman of grace and honor, laid to rest with all royal dignity. But for those who remembered the little girl who dreamed of the stars, her death was not a royal farewell. It was the final closing of a tragedy that had begun the day her fate was sealed. Fatma Sultan's story is not just about one woman's suffering. It is a window into a system where power consumed innocence, where princesses lived in palaces of gold but died in prisons of silence. And yet, her story is only one among many. For behind every Ottoman princess celebrated in poems and parades, there may have been another Fatma, another life broken on the altar of empire. But what if Fatma's silence was not the end of her story? What if her mutism itself was a form of rebellion, a refusal to give the empire the satisfaction of her voice? Fatma Sultan's story was not unique. Behind the gilded gates of Topkapi Palace, Her silence echoed with countless others, because Fatma was not the only daughter of empire, and she was not the only one who entered her wedding night trembling with terror. The Ottoman Empire at its peak dazzled the world with riches, architecture, armies, and power. To outsiders, the princesses lived like queens of a dreamland. Jewels as heavy as armor, gardens perfumed with roses, silks imported from the east. But the truth beneath that glitter was far darker. For every wedding, for every glorious union, another girl's voice was broken, another mind silenced, another life repurposed for politics. The ritual Fatma endured, the bowing, the restricted vocabulary, the underground rehearsals, the chamber of consummation, was not hers alone. It was the hidden machinery of empire, a system perfected over centuries to ensure obedience, silence, and control. And yet, within that silence, whispers of rebellion survived. Court records, often buried or censored, reveal the struggles of many royal women. Princess Sultan, a niece of Fatma, collapsed on her wedding night and never recovered her health. Historians note her symptoms mirror modern PTSD. Mehrimah Sultan, centuries earlier, disguised her despair with charm and wit, yet privately wrote letters filled with anguish at being treated as currency of empire. Hadis Sultan, Fatma's cousin, attempted to poison herself on the eve of her wedding, but was revived by palace doctors. The event was erased from official chronicles. Behind the silks and jewels, the golden cage was the same. Some princesses dared to resist in shocking ways. There are tales of staged illnesses, fainting spells exaggerated, sudden plagues declared within the palace, even false reports of death spread to avoid unwanted marriages. One rumor tells of a princess whose family faked her burial to save her from an abusive pasha. She lived hidden for years, her identity erased, until her death in obscurity. Whether myth or truth, these stories prove something vital. Not all royal daughters surrendered willingly. Resistance also took subtler forms. In embroidery, the delicate art of stitching silks, some women hid secret messages. Patterns of tulips and stars were woven with slight variations, symbols understood only by sisters and trusted maids. A flower tilted slightly left might mean, "I am not free." A star with a broken edge might whisper, "Do not forget me." These codes, scattered across the surviving gowns and tapestries, are almost invisible to historians today. But for the women who lived inside the palace walls, they were a language of solidarity, a rebellion stitched in silence. On rare occasions, princesses dared to confront the system openly. In the archives of the Ottoman court lie dusty petitions written by royal women, demanding separation from husbands who beat them, neglected them, or drove them to despair. A handful were successful. Divorce was granted, dowries returned, lives reshaped. These women were the exceptions. Their victories whispered with awe among palace servants. But even these rare sparks of resistance were dangerous. For a princess who dared to challenge the machinery of empire risked not just disgrace but disappearance. What makes these fragments of rebellion so haunting is their rarity. Most voices were silenced before they could ever speak. And yet, the very existence of fake deaths, secret codes, and petitions proves one thing. Ottoman princesses were not passive dolls. They were women trapped in an iron system, but some still found ways to resist. For every Fatma Sultan who became a living ghost, there may have been another who whispered through stitches, who faked her own death, who dared to write to the throne itself. Their resistance, though small, cracks the myth of royal obedience. But the empire did not allow these rebellions to shape the official story. Historians of the time, writing under royal patronage, painted the princesses as paragons of purity, dignity, and obedience. Their trauma was erased, their rebellion buried, their humanity rewritten into myth. Only in scattered notes, secret archives, and whispered rumors do we catch glimpses of the truth that these women lived not in palaces of gold, but in prisons of fear. The truth that the Ottoman wedding night was not a celebration of love, but a ritual of control. And so we return to the question, why did Ottoman princesses fear their wedding night? Because it was not just a night of intimacy. It was the night when the empire itself entered their chamber. But the darkest part of this tradition is not what happened in the 1600s. It's how its echoes still haunt culture today. Fatma Sultan's story feels personal. A single girl, a single wedding night, a single scream buried beneath silk and marble. But the truth is far larger. Her pain was not a tragedy of one. It was the blueprint of empire. The Ottoman dynasty, at its height, ruled millions of people, 3 continents, and a sea of cultures. Its palaces glittered with fountains, marble, mosaics, and gold leaf that reflected like sunlight. But what built this empire of splendor? Blood, sacrifice, and the silent suffering of its own daughters. The same dynasty that celebrated conquest and victory consumed its children in rituals of control. To ensure stability, they crushed individuality. To preserve power, they sacrificed voices. Fatma Sultan's broken spirit was not an accident. It was the cost of power, a price paid by generations of women whose names we will never know. When travelers came to Istanbul, they marveled at the beauty of the Topkapi Palace. They wrote of gilded domes, perfumed gardens, and walls painted with lapis lazuli. But what they never saw, what they were never meant to see, were the underground chambers where girls rehearsed their obedience, the mirrors that forced them to watch their own degradation, and the wedding beds where silence was demanded and resistance punished. Every empire tells a story of glory, but every empire hides a story of suffering. In the Ottoman world, the screams of women were buried beneath songs of triumph. Fatma's story is rare because it survived. Most did not. Most princesses left behind nothing but names on genealogical charts, faint mentions in dowry accounts, or flattering verses crafted by court poets. The truth, their pain, their resistance, their humanity, was deliberately erased. Because if those truths had been spoken aloud, they would have shattered the illusion of imperial dignity. They would have shown that beneath the crown, even the empire itself was fragile, trembling, and afraid. The scream of Fatma Sultan was not the only one. It was simply the one history failed to erase. What does this story mean today? Why does it matter that one Ottoman princess, 4 centuries ago, lived and died in silence? Because history repeats itself. Because power, unchecked, always turns inward. Because the cycle of domination, control, and silenced voices is not gone. You see it in forced marriages across the world. You see it in the suppression of women's education. You see it in every society where those in power consume the vulnerable to keep their illusion of control. Alive, Fatma's life is not just a story of the 1600s, it is a warning written in blood and silence. And so, the larger truth is this: empires do not fall only because of battles lost or enemies at the gate. Sometimes they rot from within. When power devours its own children, it plants the seeds of its own destruction. Fatma Sultan was one voice silenced, but her silence echoes still. And perhaps in telling her story we break that silence, even if only for a moment. History paints palaces in gold, but behind every jewel there may be a tear. Fatma Sultan's silence was not just hers, it was a silence shared by countless daughters of empire, and perhaps that silence was the loudest rebellion of all. For centuries these stories were buried beneath marble and silk, but today we can uncover them and ask the questions history tried to silence. Do you think Fatma Sultan's silence was tragedy or defiance? Drop your thoughts below, because the truth of history is never just in the archives. It lives in the voices that dare to remember. If you want more untold stories the world was never meant to hear, make sure to subscribe. The next chapter in our series may shock you even more than this one.